Let's look deeper at this. Let's bring in Meghan Benton in Toulouse. She's Director of Global Programmes at the independent think tank, the Migration Policy Institute. Good to see you. And also good to see you, Dave Keating, our correspondent in Brussels. Let's begin with you, Meghan. I want to start, before we go on to this speech from Shabana Mahmood and how significant it is, let's look at what came before, because ultimately the proof of the pudding is in the eating. Tell us about the Danish system. And this is a system that was counter to Scandinavian neighbours. It was seen as deeply tough. Some suggested, critics, that it was racist. Now appears to be, amongst some at least, the golden boy, the golden way forward for migration.
Yeah, thanks for having me. So Denmark has had for some time now a sort of temporary by default approach to refugee protection. It also does a number of other things. It has departure centres to encourage voluntary return of failed asylum seekers. It has really strict rules on which refugees can bring in family members. They have to be self-sufficient, 24 years old. And it's also had some very symbolic laws, including most famously the jewellery law, which was brought in 2016, which means police can confiscate asylum seekers' cash or valuables to help pay for their stay in the country.
If I remember rightly, go back to 2015. This was happening at a time that I think that Denmark changed its laws. The architect of this is credited to the Prime Minister, now Foreign Secretary, Lars Løkke Rasmussen, whereby I think you have to give a certain amount to stay in Denmark. This is around 7,000 euros. And that's where the jewellery law came in. There's also another, what's seen as fairly controversial to some, which is the parallel lives law. Tell us about that and how they look at where migrants, refugees are living.
Yeah, so that's trying to tackle ghettoisation, so segregation in particular areas of cities. So it sort of restricts the number of people of immigrant background who can live in any local area, which has also been extremely controversial. You mentioned that this was a 2016 development, but what's been really interesting with Denmark is that the Social Democrats had to have a real look at their policies and think about what a sort of progressive version of being restrictionist on immigration would look like. So when they came to power in 2019, they had something called the paradigm shift, and that was really shifting towards, trying to make Denmark a kind of inhospitable place to go to relative to its neighbours, essentially.
It will be very interesting to see if Britain adopts the jewellery law. And just to add to just contest what you were saying, so this is enacted in 2016. Authorities are able to seize cash and valuables worth more than 10,000 Danish kroner, around 1,300 euros, from asylum seekers and migrants upon arrival. How is that being viewed there? Is that being seen as one of the key reasons? I'm just interested on that and what they are crediting to driving down the asylum applications.
Yeah, so I've seen floated in a few newspapers in the UK recently these sort of staggering 90% drops in Denmark. And actually a lot of that came from 2015 to 2016, when we saw that across Europe, in part because the EU signed a deal with Turkey. Turkey started holding people back from crossing the Mediterranean. Denmark has seen larger shifts than elsewhere. And a lot of that is credited to the shift towards giving temporary protection as the kind of default, as well as, really ramping up returns. As I said, restricting access to family unification. It's hard to tell which of these one things really made the difference. And then the symbolism of it, the messaging. So the jewellery law that you mentioned, I think that's probably been a really small piece of the policy puzzle, but it's contributed to the sort of messaging around the hostility that was trying to be conveyed.
Which takes us to two areas, doesn't it, Meghan? One is, you touched upon this just a short while ago, the kind of the significance of the politics here, with the Social Democrats, the centre-left, aware of the move, the popularity, the voters looking to the right and what has happened in the past in Denmark. We see some echoes of that in the UK, the local elections recently, the big uptick in support for, the anti-immigration party was the anti-European party that now is Reform under Nigel Farage. And that sense that, critics of Shabana Mahmood would say she's listening to the dog whistle, she's moving to the right, but Shabana Mahmood's argument is that she is a daughter of migrants to the UK, and she says that illegal immigration is tearing the UK apart.
Yeah, I think there's a huge desire to see more control in the system right now. And, you mentioned the rise of reform, but actually the mainstream parties across Europe are making their policies in the shadow of the far right. I think what's been less noticed with the Home Secretary's announcement and what she was writing yesterday is that she's also announcing an expansion in safe and orderly routes for protection, and specifically in community sponsorship, which is seen as the kind of gold standard for how you get communities bought into selecting and receiving and integrating refugees. That kind of borrows a bit from the Homes for Ukrainians model that was used as the Ukraine response. So I think what she's trying to do is say, we'll reduce the kind of gold-plated asylum that has been the concern about the pull factor, but then also try to open up kind of orderly protection routes. Now, it remains to be seen how large those will be, and I'm sure that advocates will be really concerned about some of the unintended consequences of the asylum restrictions. But I think it is all trying to convey a sense of we have control over the system. Now, my concern is that I think it overwhelmingly comes down to a perception of small boats. It doesn't really matter to the public if you have somebody claiming asylum after being in the country for a while. I mean, that is a threat to the integrity of the system, but it's not visible. It's not the sense of disorder and chaos that people see with small boats.
And more than a sense of disorder and chaos, I think it's fair to say, though, isn't it, Meghan? I was in reporting from France, reported from Gravelines back in 2017, 2018. 2017, we were looking for boats. We'd heard rumours of boats. At this time, they were mainly stowaway lorries. We found from 4 o'clock in the morning, 7 o'clock until 7 o'clock, the boats were leaving Gravelines. Fast forward to now, there was around 300 travelling then across. Now we're looking at 43,000 to June this year. And you can go to that same beach and they're leaving from the same time. So there is a sense of the government trying to get control of this. And I want to bring Dave in at this point as well, Meghan, because I want to come back. There's a couple of issues, one on asylum processing and one on deterrent as well. Dave, on the issue when it comes to Britain changing its system for refugees, the idea being that once you're granted status as a refugee, you can stay for life. Now, similar to the Danish model, you look at this every 2 years. If the country of origin is deemed safe, they go back. And it looks like people could have to stay up to 20 years in the UK to then get permanent status. Tell us how this is viewed within the corridors behind you in the EU.
Well, in Denmark, this has resulted for a lot of uncertainty for migrants because, as you say, if the situation of the home country is reviewed periodically and clearly at the same time the bar has been lowered for what is considered safe and stable for the home country, then it can introduce this level of uncertainty, which probably is a big part of the reason why Denmark's asylum seeker numbers have dropped so much. Now, it's natural for the British Labour government to be looking to Denmark. Denmark's government is also a centre-left government. The Prime Minister, Mette Frederiksen, sits in the same centre-left European group as British Prime Minister Keir Starmer. But also, currently, this model by Denmark is receiving generally positive views here in Brussels. Now, Denmark right now holds the rotating presidency of the EU Council. You can see that sign behind me welcoming people to the presidency here at the council building. And really, Mette Frederiksen has been in the driver's seat on migration policy because other countries are looking very interestedly at what's happened in Denmark. In particular, she's teamed up with Italy's right-wing Prime Minister, Giorgia Meloni, on this migration issue, and the two of them have really been leading the way in the council. Politics makes for interesting bedfellows. One person from the center-left, one person from the far right, coming together on this migration issue. But really, you can see how the Danish Prime Minister has gotten ahead on this issue when no one else in the council seems to have had very good answers to this, and particularly when so many on the right side of the spectrum have just made a lot of noise but actually not reduced numbers. Denmark now has the strictest asylum policy in the European Union, and that's coming from a center-left government.
Just realised where you are, Dave. We can't quite work out the sign behind you. You can see the bright lights, but you're in the Justice Lipsis building, aren't you, in the European Council? Just listening to Dave, Meghan,
Indeed.
He makes a very interesting point about the weight. There's another point I want to raise with you, which is about conversations, arguments about whether Britain, and it has been to some degree previously in Denmark, how you work with the European Convention on Human Rights. We've had mouths off from Mr Farage and others saying actually it's not the place to sit. Britain has to relook at this. Shabana Mahmood today talking about how they want to change Article 8, who thinks this is on the right to a family life. And it's about how judges interpret and wanting to explain to them. Let me explain to you, I think, make sure we're getting a sense of this. Basically, such as telling the judges to tighten those, the application of it to family, close family and children who would come over with refugees, and also giving more weight to the wider public interest when it comes to each case. What's your understanding of how that could change?
Yeah, so I mean, there's been momentum growing across the EU, across ECHR signatories for reform to the ACHR, and so there are a number of interested countries right now. The UK is one of them. This announcement today seems to be what they're planning to do domestically, so providing guidance to the way that the Human Rights Act, which puts the ECHR into national law, on how it's interpreted by judges. To be honest, it's not totally clear what they're proposing yet. We're waiting for the statement in Parliament. But because Article 8 review, it does already allow for a balancing test, which means courts and governments can weigh the rights of migrants against overall public order already. I think what they're saying is that factually they're going to try and give more weight to the public order side to prevent people from resisting deportation, especially for family members who aren't direct family that they don't live with.
In the meantime, Dave, as we wait for this, just listening to Meghan on the UK system, you mentioned Georgia Maloney and this scenario where both her and Mette Frederiksen, centre-left on the hard right, working together. It's not one big working conglomerate right now, though, is it? And it is worth saying, kind of standing up, not just against European leaders, but to some degree against President Trump as well on his right-wing policies, on his policies of migration, is there in the south of Europe, in Spain. Pedro Sanchez, tell us about that.
Yeah, I mean, Pedro Sanchez has probably been the lone voice really strongly resisting this move on migration. We saw at the last European Council last month, they had a discussion on migration, and he was really the only voice arguing for a more, let's say, liberal, more left-leaning position. Emmanuel Macron was not particularly vocal in that discussion. But he is in kind of the minority at the moment. And we see, you mentioned the ECHR, that is something separate from the European Union. That's the European Court of Human Rights, administered by the Council of Europe in Strasbourg, different organization. That Denmark's policy has come in for some trouble with that, but really around the edges. So the two things that the ECHR has said are a problem is this family reunification. They say this 3-year time period, again, as you were just saying, violates this right to a family life. And secondly, these parallel lives designations in some of the low-income housing where the asylum seekers are kept. They've also found problems with that. But Denmark is trying to get that changed. And they've joined with a number of EU countries writing a letter to the ECHR saying you need to change these rules because they were invented 75 years ago for an entirely different time. And the ECHR has been fairly receptive to that. So I think if you're looking at the situation in the UK and what the different political parties are telling people, Reform is saying, let's just pull out of the ECHR, there's no hope for reform. In the EU, governments are working with the ECHR possibly to update those definitions. And there has been progress on that. So it would be rather unfortunate if the UK left the ECHR and then the following month they changed the rules to actually be more in line with the migration policy that the Labour government wants. So I think Labour right now is pointing out that other governments are able to work with this as well.
Very interesting. Very briefly, Meghan, it's not just a lone footprint heading to Borgen in Copenhagen. It's worth saying that the Austrian officials, German officials, have also been talking about the Danish model. I just wonder whether you see this spreading.
Yeah, I mean, Austria right now has restricted family unification on a temporary basis. It says it has a pause, and it's had quite a significant drop in asylum applications, which it's crediting to that. You see similar trends across Germany. I mean, Germany now talking about repatriating some of its Syrian population. So I do think this is the direction of travel across Europe. In many ways, Denmark was the first of the party, but now it seems to be the way that everything is headed.
Thank you, both of you. Meghan Benton, Director of Global Programmes at the independent think tank, the Migration Policy Institute. Thank you very much. And Dave Keating, our man in Brussels. Great to talk to you as always. Thank you both.